channel, and so everything after this should be live.
Fantastic. Hello, my name is Mary Jones. I serve as chair of the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask members of the advisory to respond to a roll call to signify your presence at this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call or other electronic medium. Jim Kilmartin.
Present.
Gertine Coleman.
Here.
Nicole Eitzen.
Here.
Chris Haben.
Here.
Marcy Lechtenberg.
Here.
Heidi Bella.
I don't see Heidi on the call.
I was going to say, is Heidi on? Okay. I note the following BSRB staff members are also present: David Fye.
Here.
And Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David's going to read a message about this remote meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Mary. This is Dave Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about any concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the Executive Director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment today, as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended. Therefore, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On November 7th, 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meeting. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website on the day of the meeting, and they are available right now. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call line is active. I did check before we started the meeting. There's no one currently on the conference call. And then one little note on the agenda that you had received. When you are reviewing that to approve the agenda, I just want to let you know we caught one little typographical error after we sent this out. Under old business, item B, there's an item noted continued discussion of proposed changes to unprofessional conduct regulations for other professions, and it's missing a T. We did notice that, and we've corrected that on the official copy. So apologize for the error, but with that, we should be good to go.
Thank you so much for that, David. So first item of business is review of the agenda. And as
Hey,
Dave
Mary,
noted, there's, yes.
Heidi just messaged me. Is she in the weight room by chance?
I don't see her in the waiting room, but I will keep an eye on that. If she attempts to log in, I can try to let her into the waiting room.
Okay.
And I'll resend the Zoom information for the meeting.
That's what I was just going to say. Maybe we should resend the Zoom link and make sure she has the most up-to-date Zoom link. Okay, first item of business is a review of the agenda. We'll note the correction made by David. And if there's no other changes to this, then we'll take a motion to approve.
Move to approve with the changes noted by David.
Second.
There is also a date correction, David.
A date correction for the...
Yeah, on the, right before the call to order, it says Tuesday, December 12th, 2022. And at top, it says Friday, December 12th, 2023. So just note those.
Okay.
And with those changes, we'll take Jim's motion to approve in a second, please.
A second.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Excellent. Next item of business is the approval of the minutes from the previous advisory committee, which is in your packet. And same thing, once we've reviewed those, if there's no changes, we'll take a motion to approve.
And move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Marcy. Is there thank you, Nicole. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign. Great. Dave, I will turn it over to you for your executive director's report.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And Heidi has now entered the Zoom, so she is present as well. We're going to begin my report today by talking about an unusual item, and then we'll talk about some operations updates, and then some meetings from the board, and then some legislative news as well. So first, the unusual item. So later this week, there is going to be a unique opportunity. Mary Jones and I are going to be able to attend a meeting from the Council of State Governments, CSG, to gauge interest on a multi-state compact for the marriage and family therapy profession. This meeting came up fairly recently, and we're really interested to see what other thoughts from individuals from other states or how much information CSG has already kind of put together. But there's not currently a formal draft of the compact. I think there has been some discussion over the last few years, but that'll be a really interesting meeting. So that'll be later this week on Thursday from, I believe, about 1 to 2 or 2 to 3. But looks like that will be, yes, from 2 to 3. So looking forward to that meeting and learning kind of what is tentatively the plan going forward. Concerning some operations updates, I did want to let you know about licensing first. We are continuing to see growth in BSRB licenses. As of the last official report, we provide a report to the board every full board meeting. So at the beginning of November, there are 15,365 permanent licenses under the board. And it is noted that at some point over the next few years, we do anticipate that this will be decreasing, or potentially the rate of increase will be slowing. And part of that is due to the state of Kansas joining a number of multi-state compacts and the expectation that potentially the state will join additional compacts here in the future. And one of the reasons I'm referencing this is we've been working to try to quantify workforce and professionals in the mental health field. And the professions that we regulate are a bit unique compared to some of the more hands-on professions where you are physically located in a state if you are working in that state. For some of our licensees, a fair number of them live outside of the state of Kansas, but provide services either in the state part of the year or provide telehealth services. And so with these multi-state compacts, it is providing alternative paths to practice without having a traditional licensure in the state. 2 years ago, we joined a compact for psychologists called IPAC, which was primarily designed to assist with allowing licensed psychologists who have one permanent license in their home state the ability to apply to the IPAC Commission for the ability to practice telehealth services in other states. There's a small ability to provide up to 30 days of in-state practice as well if you choose to pursue that, but for most of that is designed for telehealth. And so some individuals discontinued having their license under the psychology profession to practice under PsyPAC authority. Recently, the state of Kansas has joined a compact for professional counseling, and that compact is not yet fully operational, but once it does, certain professional counselors will be able to obtain a privilege to practice, which will be an alternative to traditional licensure. And so they'll have to maintain a license in their home state, but as long as it's another compact state, they would be able to get that privilege to practice versus traditional licensure. And next year, I anticipate the legislature will be considering a bill on a social work compact, and that one is situated a little bit differently as well. The social work compact is set up so that it would create basically two types of permanent license, a single state license and a multi-state license. And so if you currently are a social worker, for example, and you practice in one state, but you want to practice in several others right now, you likely have to obtain a license in each one of those states. Under this new format, you would be able to obtain a multi-state license in your home state. And as long as you had that multi-state license, you could practice in each of the other compact states without obtaining a specific license in those states. And so that compact has just recently been finalized as far as the drafting. Only one state has passed it so far, but that's likely due to the time frame when that language was adopted. And so Missouri is a member of the compact, but like I said, I think the state of Kansas will consider a bill for that compact next year. And I believe that there's over 1,000, maybe close to 1,500 social workers that have a license in Kansas currently that practice or that live outside of the state. And so under this model, I anticipate that a lot of those individuals, if not all of them, would switch to a multi-state license. So the reason why I'm framing this is because in our discussions about workforce and individuals providing services, I do think based on these compacts and these new ways of practice, we'll need to start to quantify how many people are providing services a little bit differently. And I do think that when we have all these compacts fully operational, our overall licensing numbers are going to go down. And I think some people are going to look at that and they're going to say, you know, we're losing all these people. And I really don't think the issue. I think the issue is going to be we're having more people practice into the state. We're just going to we'll need to find a good way to quantify that. And so for the SIPAC Commission, they're doing a survey later this year to ask individuals, what states are you practicing into? We know how many people have a license in Kansas that are practicing under SIPAC authority, but we don't really currently know how many people from other states are providing services into the state. That's going to be one attempt to try to quantify that. But moving forward, this will have to be kind of a continuing conversation. Another item I wanted to touch base with you on is the BSRB is attempting to move towards more digital processing. I've talked a little bit about this fall, our efforts to move some of our paper records from physically here at the office to the archive. The Historical Society has agreed to provide archiving service for different state agencies. And so we applied to have our document retention schedule shortened so that we would have to keep those files physically here at the office a shorter period of time. And so we were able to free up about 8 years of records to be able to transfer to the Historical Society, but it took a little bit of work by staff, or quite a bit of work, to go through all those paper records, get them organized, and then obtain the boxes for us to transfer those out. Once we do have those moved, we'll be able to open up more space for staff in traditional office space. We are also looking at taking first steps forward for our existing paper records that we do need to keep here at the office, getting approval to store those digitally versus in paper form. And I think once we have that process in place, it will be more helpful for staff members. We have tried to obtain new technology, and we have to obtain new technology for staff members, replacing a lot of our traditional desktop computers with laptops. And one of the functional things that will be helpful is once we have our records stored electronically versus paper, staff members will be able to work remotely a lot more effectively, and it probably will speed up the process for licensing as well. So it is a big undertaking to convert from paper to electronic, and there are certain checks that the state does require concerning having adequate backups, having some offsite. So we're making sure that we're following all the right processes, but we are moving forward on that. And then I did want to make you aware of 2 meetings we had since the last time your advisory committee met. These were not official meetings of the board, but these were informational forums that we put on for different groups of people. Leslie Allen and I routinely provide information to different groups of students about the licensing process and disciplinary matters. The board and other advisory committees have been talking this past year about it might be helpful for us to reach out to representatives from the schools and have more dialogue and conversation. And also potentially to reach out to individuals who are employers of mental health professionals under the board. And so years ago, the board had some roundtable discussions, which were individuals physically getting together in a room and sitting across from each other and discussing certain matters. But with the growth of programs in the state of Kansas and the nature of some of the online programs, we thought it might be helpful for a first step in starting those conversations again, to put on an informational forum, one designed specifically for educators from schools that have programs for the professions that we regulate, and to offer that for anyone who wanted to attend from different schools. As a base, we used our old contact list for those roundtables, but we understood we didn't get a lot of information back from individuals, and we think that needed to be an updated list. And so we started reaching out to additional programs, but given the short window of time, we realized that we likely missed a lot of individuals from certain programs. That was definitely not intentional, but this was the first step forward to regrow that list, and we're looking to add more individuals to it. And that meeting did occur on October 17th. I put together some information with some updates on the BSRB, also organized some information about recent changes in law in the 2021 legislative session, the 22 legislative session, and the 23 legislative session. In preparation for the meeting, some of the questions I had received from representatives from schools, it appeared to me that not everyone was aware of all the recent changes in law. And so in having good conversations and talking about possible future changes, I thought it would be helpful to establish sort of a base of information so that we all understood, where things currently are at, and then take another step forward in the future and maybe talk about some changes to regulations and talk a little bit more about other possible changes. So after we discussed those recent changes in law, we opened it up for a Q&A session and took some questions from representatives from the schools, and then provided some of that information to the board at the board's October 23rd meeting. And then the following day, on October 18th, for the first time, to my knowledge, we had an informational forum specifically for employers of those mental health professionals. And we opened that meeting up and tried to put together a list for the first time of individuals that could be contacts for that meeting and future meetings. For the educator forum, we had over 30 attendees, and for the employer forum, I think we had close to 40. So really positive response. And then the feedback that I had received after that was really positive as well. I did get some contacts from individuals who had not heard about those meetings, and I apologize for that. It was definitely not that we were looking to exclude anyone. It was really just our best efforts to grow the list as quickly as possible, but also wanted to get that meeting in this year and hoping to have more meetings similar to that in future years. Next, I'll move to some updates from past board meetings. The board did hold an offsite planning meeting on October 23rd. This is something the board seeks to do at least once a year, have an all-day meeting in person. And so that meeting does move around the state. Last year it was in Kansas City, this year it was in Wichita. And the board held the all-day meeting and discussed a number of different items. One, there were some fee regulations that the board voted with a roll call vote to make permanent. Earlier this session, a large bill passed that affected the BSRB. It was sub for Senate Bill 131. And while there were 2 items in that bill that were for other state agencies, the vast majority of it was BSRB items. And the base of that bill was a bill that we had requested introduction of on behalf of recommendations of the board earlier this year. And so there were some changes by the legislature throughout that process. But with the passage of Senate Bill 131, the board had offered up a number of new licenses to resolve some existing issues and provide more flexibility and more pathways for licensure. And so that bill sets the cap for those fees to charge for those licenses. But for us to actually issue those licenses, there has to be a specific amount set under the cap. And so to make sure that we can move forward as quickly as possible, as soon as that bill became effective in July, we brought a temporary regulation to the board for review and approval to set the specific amounts for those fees. Temporary regulations only last for a few months. And so we followed that up with permanent regulations for the fees, and that has to be held open for 60 days to allow public comment. There's also a meeting here at the BSRB office in which we allow individuals to come in person to provide additional comment, and the fees regulations were published in the Secretary of State's publication, the Kansas Register. And so the board voted to make those fees permanent. And so those were made permanent as of November 17th, 2023. However, because we had utilized the temporary fee regs followed by the permanent fee regs, most people probably saw no change between the two. But really excited to go ahead and move forward on that item. There are some other regulations that are working their way through the system, and I think they're close to being able to be open for public comment, but right now they are being reviewed by the Attorney General's office, and once they complete their review, if they approve for us to open those up, we'll be able to kind of move forward with a open public comment time period for that as well. At the October 23rd meeting, there was also a discussion by the board on an item that your advisory committees and others had talked about recently. There is a requirement in the regulations that for individuals pursuing hours towards clinical licensure, they have to submit a clinical training plan to be approved. And then if they want to make a change to that clinical training plan, those changes have to be submitted within 45 days of making the change. And the current language and regulation says that for individuals who fail to submit the change within 45 days, the board shall strike those hours. And so the board recently had a conversation, and the advisory committees as well, about is that rule accomplishing the primary goal of the board for that purpose? And so some different alternatives had been discussed. Ultimately, what the board decided was to request a change in regulation that will need to go through the process. But ultimately, once this regulation is changed, the change the board had recommended was to keep the 45-day rule in place. However, to strike the specific language saying if you failed to meet that 45-day requirement, your hours would not count. And what this means is that for individuals who make a change, they still need to report that to the board within 45 days. However, if they don't submit that change within 45 days, we will be able to review that later. It might delay someone's review for their application because if we're able to get those updates in a timely manner, we can review those throughout the process. But if someone does not send that within the 45 days, we can still look at that. And as long as it would be still hours that we would be able to approve under the regulations, we would be able to approve those at the end of the process. However, if someone made a change and the hours would no longer count, then the board still would have the authority to reject those hours as they are not in accord with what we can approve under the regulation. So the big takeaway is that the big thing that was changed is the mandatory striking of the hours simply for failing to meet that 45-day requirement. Another item the board discussed and came to an opinion on requesting a change is language in the regulations also involving individuals pursuing clinical licensure. That states for every 15 hours of direct client contact, you need to have 1 hour of supervision. And the change the board recommended on this was to remove that specific language. However, the total number of supervision hours would still stay the same. You would still be required to meet twice a month. However, the specific language that required 1 hour of supervision every time you had 15 hours of direct client contact, that language is recommended by the board to be removed. So the change to the 45-day requirement and the change to this 1 hour language will need to be submitted based on the time frame for review of changes to regulations. I think it's likely that this won't take effect probably until late next year, but I did want to make you aware of it now since we had those discussions recently, and so you would know that that change will be submitted through the process. Additionally, the board had a discussion about the minimum length of time to accrue hours towards a clinical license. Previously, the requirements had been 4,000 hours in a time frame of not less than 2 years. However, in the last few years for the professions, that total number of hours had been decreased from 4,000 to 3,000 hours. But at that time, there was no discussion whether the minimum length of time should be reduced proportionally based on that decrease from 4,000 hours to 3,000 hours. And recently, the question has come up, well, if it was 24 months for 4,000 hours, is it reasonable to reduce that from 24 months to 18 months if you're decreasing it from 4,000 to 3,000? One item that complicates this discussion is there has been a recent change in federal law to allow certain individuals new eligibility for Medicare reimbursement, specifically in the fields of marriage and family therapy and professional counseling. The way that that federal law is defined is it talks about there's a definition of which practitioners fit into those categories. And for marriage and family therapy and professional counseling, one of the items in the definition is having 2 years of postgraduate supervised experience. And so the issue is if this is changed by the board from 24 months down to 18 months, there was concern that potentially this could disqualify anyone in Kansas who might fit under the previous definition and be ineligible for reimbursement for Medicare when that starts next year. And that was definitely not what the board was intending, but to make sure that this was not something that would be an issue, I had reached out to representatives from the Department for Aging and Disability Services and also from the Department of Health and Environment. It's a little complicated because Medicare generally is more of a federal reimbursement versus a state type reimbursement. However, there is some intersection, and those are the states that primarily deal with reimbursements. And so they said that they were reviewing that issue. They are continuing to look at it, but they recommended at this time if the board could wait to make a change just to make sure that there's not an inadvertent consequence on individuals and their eligibility for reimbursement. So the board decided not to take any action on this item at this time, but discussed the value and having a future discussion on that item once we have more things clarified. Additionally, there was discussion about supervision by other professions for the marriage and family therapy and professional counseling professions. Right now, there is language and regulation that requires both of those professions to have board-approved supervisors, and then also indicates that the supervisors should be of the same profession. However, under extenuating circumstances, you could have someone from another profession provide supervision. The definition of extenuating circumstances is defined in the regulation, and it is a pretty severe test to meet. It calls for an extreme condition or situation outside the person's control, which makes it the person unable to meet the requirements of the regulation or inadvisable for them to meet the requirements. And so there's been a fair amount of discussion by your advisory committee and also professional counselors. The board basically asked the advisory committees to kind of continue those conversations and then to provide any recommendations back to the board. The board could consider any possible changes. Possible changes with keeping extenuating circumstances as the test involved for other individuals from professions to provide supervision. And second, whether those two professions would like to continue to keep the language and regulation that even allows members from other professions to provide supervision. And so those are the two items the board had asked for more discussion, and if there's any requested change for a recommendation to be forwarded back to the board. Also, the board discussed with legal counsel putting together a standardized process for reconsideration requests when individuals apply for licensure or submit a complaint or have a complaint against them. The board will review those, and then an order will be issued if someone is denied for licensure. If they are denied for licensure or licensed with conditions, that order provides certain remedies. One is to request a hearing before a hearing panel of the board. And then second, they can request a reconsideration. And so the board worked through setting up a standard format for that process, and we'll be using that standard format moving forward. Additionally, the board discussed a new change in federal law that would allow certain military members and military spouses the opportunity to provide or to practice under a new model. Right now, those individuals have to obtain a license in Kansas, but based on a change in federal law, it would provide a new pathway for individuals who are interested in practicing under sort of a license recognition model. And so if they had an active license in their jurisdiction and they had received orders to relocate to a new state, as long as their license had a similar scope of practice to what that state was licensed, states are being asked to recognize that new license if the military member or military spouses, they choose to use this new license recognition process. So we've been working through this with legal counsel. I've reached out to some representatives from other states to see how they're addressing this as well. This does not replace traditional licensure. It merely provides a different pathway. We have not had anyone request to be considered under this yet, but we do have a idea in mind, and we have a sort of an outline of what steps we will follow. And so we will be handling any request like this on a case-by-case basis to make sure that they would still meet those requirements in federal law. And then the board has been discussing how best to provide information to the public that these individuals are authorized to practice. And so we'll probably have something on our website indicating any individuals who are authorized to practice under this new item in federal law. The board also had a discussion about possibly reaching an agreement to work with a company called CE Broker. CE Broker is a company which works with state licensing boards to offer a free service so that if those licensing boards partner with CE Broker, individuals who have to obtain continuing education hours will have a free account that they can use to upload documentation of completion of CE hours. And basically, the way this is helpful is that if those individuals are selected for audit, then instead of physically mailing the materials to the office, and waited on the time frames for their materials to be reviewed, those hours can be reviewed in a much shorter time frame. And also there's a benefit to the licensee of not having to maintain stacks and stacks of paper documents and records that you completed those hours. There is no cost to the BSRB if the board would enter into that agreement. There's also not a cost to the licensees. However, the way the company does make money is they offer some optional services, higher paid accounts if individuals want to pursue those. And based on certain individuals selecting to pursue those, that is how they have enough sufficient funding for operations. So currently that company has reached an agreement to work with the Board of Healing Arts and the Board of Nursing as well. They recently had rolled out the e-broker agreement. The board requested a presentation from the company, and so that occurred at the board meeting on November 13th. The e-broker attended that meeting and provided information on the services that that company provides. Additionally, the board asked some questions about information security, and then also sort of the legal agreement in terms of shared information, shared data. And so since that time of the meeting, the board is going to continue to review information on the e-broker. Did not reach a decision at that time if they want to partner with the e-broker, but I have gone ahead and talked with representatives from our IT staff for the Information Technology Services here in Kansas to see if they can review the processes that the e-broker has in place to verify that they do have good ways to keep information secure and that their technology is something that the state would approve. And then I've also been working with our legal counsel to review the agreement to see if there's any issues within that agreement that would give our legal counsel some pause. So we're continuing to have that discussion. We'll provide an update to the board at the next meeting in January. Additionally, at that November 13th board meeting, 2 of the advisory committees forwarded recommendations to the board for consideration. The Social Work Advisory Committee has been studying the Social Work Compact and has had some presentations on the compact. They recently reached a recommendation to request that the board support a social work compact if it is introduced in legislation next year. And so the board is taking between the November board meeting and the January board meeting to research that compact more fully if they wish to do so. And then in January, the board may be asked to reach a decision if they would like to put together a position in support of the compact or some other position. Additionally, the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee had forwarded a recommendation to the board requesting the board begin to recognize something called a CPQ in Kansas. These are certificates of professional qualification. The National Association for State and Provincial Psychology Boards has put together this CPQ as a way to track and verify that individuals have met certain requirements for licensure. And this CPQ is helpful for mobility purposes when individuals move between states. Currently, right now, Kansas is only about 1 of 5 states that does not recognize the CPQ, at least in part. And so the board was asked to review this, and this is also something for the board to consider taking a position on when the board meets again in January. And the last 2 items from that board meeting, back in 2016, there was legislation in which the board was authorized to begin to do background checks with fingerprints for applicants for licensure or for disciplinary purposes. But since that time, the board has not made that a mandatory requirement for licensure. However, the new multi-state compacts that the board has entered into and some of the ones that are coming up do require, as a condition of licensure, passage of a background check with fingerprinting. The SIPAC compact that was passed a couple of years ago, it basically requires it, but gives states 10 years to implement that as a requirement. So there is still time. The professional counseling compact does require it, but they also allow a period of time that has not been established yet by the commission, and the social work compact similarly requires it, but does not specify the length of time for states to require that. So the question really before the board was looking at that requirement of background checks and fingerprinting, whether that is something that the board would want to make a requirement simply for the individuals who are practicing under the compact, or more broadly for all levels of licensing under the BSRB. So something for the board to discuss. There is current legislation, so it would not require additional legislation to implement that. There is authorization that has already been passed it's really more of a preference that the board would want to move forward to begin requiring that. Additionally, one other item the board discussed at that November board meeting in Senate Bill 131 that passed this year, there was creation of a new student temporary addiction counselor license. And this is the board's first student license. And this is a quick summary. This is a license that would allow someone to begin to provide certain services while working in a supervised position. They have to have an agreement in place with their school and also the employer. They have to have at least 60 hours towards completion of a degree in either addiction counseling or a related field. And basically they have to be making progress towards the educational qualifications to obtain an addiction counseling license. And so this is brand new this year, and in working through what would qualify for some of those educational requirements, there have been some questions that have come up before the board. The board had a discussion on that topic at the November meeting, and we'll continue that conversation at the January meeting. And then I did want to let you know, usually the board meets the second Monday of every other month. Because of a conflict with a meeting for an association for the American Association of Counseling Boards, state counseling boards, the board meeting has been moved to Friday, January 12th of 2024 at 10 a.m. And so that meeting will be on an unusual day, but that will still be occurring in January. And then one last update, just as far as legislative items, every year the legislative session begins in January. We're about a month away from the legislature beginning again this year. Currently, right now, based on the discussions the board has had and the advisory committee recommendations before the board, there is no current legislation that would go along with the board's recommendation. So there is currently not a bill being drafted on behalf of the board for this next legislative session. However, many of the changes the board has decided on this year or has requested would involve several changes to regulations. So we are making those changes in regulations, but currently right now there is not recommendations that would necessitate the implementation of or introduction of a bill for this next legislative session. However, I will be over at the Capitol. I'm sure there will be bills involving the BSRB or affecting the BSRB. And of course, every year I go over to talk to the legislature about the agency's budget to make sure that goes through as smoothly as possible. So with that, I will end my report and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. There was a lot of information I know that came out of our last board meeting. So I just wanted to step back, particularly with items that have to do with supervision and hours, and see if the advisory committee had any specific questions around the board's decision on those things. Or any other questions for Dave, sure. Go ahead, Chris.
Just for my own tracking, can be a slow study as I was taking notes. So compacts are either in place or heading for psychology, counseling, and social work, correct?
Yes,
Not
psychology has theirs already.
Right.
The rest are in process.
And is MFT heading in that direction at all? Is there any consideration
Yes.
to that? Okay.
Yes. So what's exciting is the very first thing Dave was mentioning is that we were invited to a meeting this week. He and I were from the Council of State Governments regarding an MFT interstate compact. So this is the first we've heard of it. When we were at the AMFR TRB conference earlier, I think their primary goal was clear: to get Medicare passed, and then they'd start working on other initiatives. So I'm hopeful that we'll have some information to bring back at our next meeting.
Okay. And a question about the military piece of that pathway. I can't remember how you framed it. Does that include the VA? It seems to me I've spoken with people in the VA where if you're licensed in another state, they can somehow practice in the VA. I could be clueless about that.
That's correct. In the VA, it's a federal installation, so they just have to be licensed in a state. It doesn't have to be the state where they're located.
Okay, so this is a separate thing. It's kind of like applying that concept to military. So if somebody is transferred to Fort Riley or something like that, is that kind of what this would be? Am I tracking that correctly?
I believe that it would allow people to practice in any setting in our state.
Right, yeah, they would have to be a military member or military spouse, and they would have to have orders that cause them to be physically relocated into a different state, and there's some other requirements that have to be met.
Oh, okay.
And so it's interesting because yeah, it's a new option for practice, but we have heard that some individuals may not want to pursue that just because of some of the complications with reimbursement. This is basically you would not have a license that the BSRB would issue to you. And so you would be recognized as being able to practice, but I think the majority of individuals still might pursue traditional licensure based on the newness of this or based on confusion about practicing by recognition versus licensure, but it is a new option available if individuals meet those qualifications.
So if I'm an MFT in North Carolina and my spouse is stationed there and they were transferred to Kansas, then my North Carolina license by recognition as a spouse of a person that would work in Kansas. Is that how, am I saying that correctly?
I believe so, as long as that, like I said, there's some other requirements. You need to have a license with a similar scope of practice. And so as long as those did line up correctly. But what is kind of tricky and one of the things that we've had to work through is right now, one of the ways that we're able to track requirements for individuals is based on them obtaining a license and then they come up for renewal every 2 years. With this, they would receive authorization to practice, but it would be a little more challenging to track because they have to maintain their license in their home state in order for us to continue to allow them to be able to practice here. And they don't have to meet the continuing education requirements here, but they would have to meet what they have in their home state. So it kind of depends if they want to maintain that license from the previous state, even though they're living here and practicing here.
So they would still be bound by the unprofessional conduct code here as well as whatever their home state is.
Yeah, and that's a little challenging too, because we talked about that in, for people who are licensed here, and if they commit violations of unprofessional conduct, we have the authority to fine them or condition their license. But if we're not the ones actually issuing them the license, it's a little bit tricky trying to figure out exactly the extent of our jurisdiction. I think we would be able to probably contact the state where they have a license and make them aware. And probably, I think if there was something really egregious, we could potentially try to prohibit them from practicing within the state based on the recognition. But I would think that their licensed state would still have the authority to investigate those types of complaints independently. And so, yeah, some of those items were not really spelled out through the legislation that authorized this. But when you're involving multiple states, some of those investigations can get a little complicated.
And then the 15-to-1 ratio, so as long as I at the end have a 15-to-1, I have the 1,500 hours and 100 hours of supervision, that's what matters. So if I have a week where a supervisee has 20 hours, I'm not necessarily required to have supervision that week, as long as we're staying, in essence, probably in that kind of general 15-to-1 compliance by the end. Am I interpreting that correctly?
I think so. So
Yes.
as long as you're meeting twice a month, one individual.
Yeah.
And I will say this, since it's a public meeting, people need to understand that meeting only twice a month will not get them done in 2 years. If they want to get done in 2 years, they're going to have to meet much more often than twice a month, but
Yes.
that's all that's required.
Yes.
And like I said during the summary, I know that a lot of information during that report. That change to the regulation is something that will have to go through the full process before it will be implemented. So based on the time frame of other changes we've submitted, probably late next year is the earliest I think that might be able to go into effect. So I'm always hesitant when we make we announce news about board recommendations for changes because I don't want people to immediately start to take action thinking that the board has decided, so now we can do this. It's like, well, so there is a time frame for that, but yeah, but that's hopefully kind of clarify the new path once this would go into effect.
And then this is embarrassing because I was writing something down when you were talking. We do MF, you still need, we decided not, you can't have a supervisor from another profession, correct?
Unless there are extenuating circumstances.
Right, okay, okay.
Right.
Yeah,
that-
and we put, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dave. Go ahead.
Go for it, Mary.
Well, I was going to say, we did put that item back on the agenda today as a consideration because the counseling profession, I think, was going to take that back one more time and take a swing at it. But we're the only two professions that have this particular language. And so we'll just affirm our position today that I can take back to the board.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, one item to try to help that, with 7 different advisory committees, that can be a little confusing sometimes with all the discussions about what is an official recommendation. So we've been trying to standardize that process a little bit more for board meetings and have official communicated recommendations back. So if that can be firmed up today, that would be helpful to kind of officially communicate any recommendations back to the board.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Dave or Leslie on that? Okay, thank you so much, Dave. The next item is to look at the continuing education requirement. So you do have attached 102.510 and 102.511 for documentation of continuing education. Again, Dave and I were looking through our minutes just to make sure we were clear on the advisory committee's recommendation here. We had looked at these, I think maybe 2 meetings ago. So we just want to, again, affirm our recommendation on a couple of items for continuing education. I don't know if Dave or Leslie's going to pull those up for the screen.
Sure, I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Thank you. And as we talked through a lot of these, there were just some legacy language things that were in, that we're cleaning up here. And then also things like the audio, videotape, those words. And then we had discussed, I remember also that self-directed project as well, removing that from the continuing education pieces as well. And Dave certainly pick up and fill in for my pieces here.
No, your summary was excellent. I'm showing a copy of KAR 102-5-10, which is your regulation for your profession on continuing education. And there had been discussion last time about updating some of the language. And so I've highlighted some of those references, specifically in item D4, references to videotapes and audio tapes. And we can replace that language with video recordings and audio recordings, which if individuals still have videotapes and audio tapes, it should continue to recover that, but it should be a little more broad and more contemporary. And also maybe the term telecast, maybe using a new term for that as well. And then Mary, as you mentioned, item number 7, the self-directed learning project. It appeared that not a lot of individuals were utilizing that item, and a lot of the items that could have been utilized are already covered under other areas. And so it would appear that those would be good items for more cleanup than anything of this regulation. But if there were further requested changes or questions, we wanted to provide another opportunity if anyone wanted to make some additional comments or requests.
One of the things I had brought up is if you are instructing a course, and I was looking for this as you were scrolling through of it. I think it indicates now it has to be first time only you're instructing a course. And I would continue to argue, like every time I teach the ethics class, I'm trying to make that evergreen. I would want that to be I would hope that could be something that would not have to be, can count that one time. And I was looking for that on this.
Thank you so much for reminding us of that language. And we did talk about that as a recommendation. And I think we had consensus that that made sense. And I think the solution as we looked at, it would be instead of, I think we could just strike the word first time.
Let
Or
me look real quick. I think
Yeah.
social work says something you can use. Let me look.
Well, and I agree, Mary, that taking the first time language out would solve, at least the way I'm looking at it, would solve that.
Mhm.
Out of curiosity,
Right.
are you all familiar with the term mini course?
I guess I understand what it's intended to do. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that is value added language.
It's funny, sometimes when you look through this language, there's just certain things that kind of jump out to you. So
So the
I'd be happy
social,
to,
oh,
I'm sorry, I was going to say, I'd be happy to move to remove the mini course and have it as course, seminar, institute, or workshop. I think the intent is clear. Sorry, Leslie, go ahead.
no, that's okay. I'm sorry, I thought you were done. The social work says first time preparation and presentation or the substantial revision and presentation.
Oh.
I think that's
Do
what
we
we
think,
talked about because I remember that substantial revision statement.
are we all comfortable with adopting that language?
Uh, as a public member, I just question, I do a lot of training for my own licenses. Is the intent here, if there's only 40 hours required in a 2-year period, and this participant or this licensee prepares this several times or teaches for 2 years, half of their continuing education will just be the teaching of this course over a
Only
2-year period?
only 1/4 of it because they max the hours at 10.
Maximum number of hours shall be, okay, so it's only 10, so it's 25%.
Mhm.
Okay.
Meaning it can only be counted once.
Oh, I guess that's a good
I
clarifying
think that's what
question.
maybe Jim was saying. Yeah. So if
Yeah.
you teach a class 2 springs, that's half of your continuing education.
So that would be accurate. The only other things that are required are your ethics and diagnostic.
Yeah, sorry, but the 10 max would be for the whole 2 years.
Okay.
The
So you
the maxes for each thing that are listed are for the 2-year period.
So the max would be 25%.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't mean to quibble, but what is substantial?
Well, if someone's teaching statistics year after year after year, are they going to make big revisions? Like you said, you keep it evergreen, but do you have to do that for a course that's not ethics?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
Yes, you do have to change. I mean, there's always, not always, there are often substantial or syllabus changes, curriculum changes, book changes.
I don't know, the DSM-5 TR came out and I had to completely redo what I was
Right.
in the diagnostic class. That would be substantial.
I
I
think
think
even your ethics, like you're talking about
Yeah.
year over year, is in order to maintain the most up-to-date information.
I think that a couple things. I think that the concern that I'm maybe hearing but isn't necessarily being stated is the potential abuse of this as an option. That if you are just teaching a course and are stagnant and not changing your course, that somehow is going to diminish just I guess the efficacy of you as a therapist, a licensed person. And I think if we make rules trying to catch the people who are going to break them, we will have a lot of rules because people will find ways around rules. They will try to find ways around rules. So I think the way that we suggested that change of substantial revision for the first time, I think that's fine. And that if a person gets audited and they have to then demonstrate that they revised a course, that they taught and they actually can't, then that's how they would have to deal with that consequence of not being honest up front. I just think we can't make a rule for every potential scenario.
Fair enough.
I think that's a fair point, and I certainly think, you know, we would hope that people who are teaching at this level would be able to monitor, you know, as a revision of their work and not abuse that. So I hear your point there. So are we comfortable with the substantial word change in there?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. Everyone else? Okay.
And the removal of mini course.
Yes.
In
We'll
number
remove
9.
mini course.
So if I could clarify, how would the sentence now read with the new substantial language or substantial revision?
The first time preparation and presentation of a seminar, blah, blah, blah. Or comma, or the substantial revision and presentation.
So continue to keep in the language for the first time. So that it would say preparing for and presenting for the first time, or the substantial revision of a marriage and family therapy course, seminar, institute, or workshop.
That's what I understood.
Yes. Okay, well, it sounds like we have completed the changes on this. So if we would go to the next document, 102.511, which we discussed also, again, just wanting to affirm that we got all of the changes in here. We talked about documentation for continuing education. The word original was in there. And I think we all know now we get C certificates lots of different ways, mostly via email, I think. And then we had talked about the self-directed project again, since we are striking that from the other, we would strike it from here. And then the other language that we want to clean up from videotape, audio tape, telecast, just getting rid of some of that older legacy language.
Now, just to be
Anything else?
something just kind of struck me here. At the beginning of 102-5-11, it says any of the following original signed forms of documentation. But when you go through item by item, some of them really are specifically signed and some of them are not. So I think we could probably get rid of the word signed from the beginning sentence. And then for the ones that do require signing, it states that within each of these anyway. So it's at best redundant, and possibly it doesn't make sense if you keep it in for things that aren't signed. So I'm curious if you'd be in favor of removing the word signed. So it would just say any of the following forms of documentation shall be accepted as proof.
I'm in agreement. Everyone else?
I agree too. I'm gonna hop off. I didn't want to just exit without saying something. So,
See you
Right.
soon, Nicole. Thank you.
guys.
Okay. Any other changes on this one? Okay, sounds like we have our recommendations there.
Okay, great.
Mary,
Yes.
may I bring up one thing that I don't know if it's quite related to this? I just renewed my license. I did so online. The form that if I were to do it in person, the form that you fill out, it asks if you're an approved supervisor that it asked, I think, for evidence of your continuing, the CEUs that we need for that. But when I completed the online thing, it didn't ask for that. And so there's a little part of me that was wondering, does there need to be, I don't think it would be here, but does there need to be any kind of language about what's expected for, or maybe it's in another place, about continuing ed for being an approved supervisor?
That's a really great point because it is in another location, but because we're again one of two that have the board approved supervision, it does make sense that on the, maybe on the other regulation, that we would include if you're a board approved supervisor. That's a really good.
I'm not trying to muddy the water. I had a little bit of concern when I did my own licensure renewal. I thought, it didn't ask me to confirm that I had that training, but if I filled it out on paper, it would. And so I just want to make sure that our languaging here is setting us up for what we're needing to affirm for the approved supervision as well. And that might be in a different place.
It is, we're working on getting that on the online renewal as well,
Okay.
but obviously it's not in place yet.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the regulation that we sent through that we're currently working on. So maybe we could add it in 102-5-10. I will have to talk to the Department of Administration because they do say that you cannot just repeat what's in a statute. You have to kind of expand upon it. So I don't know. I'd have to work with someone on language that we could maybe put into the reg.
So let's just kind of walking through this. If we left it alone, your requirements with like your ethics of supervision, that kind of thing, are included in terms of the continuing education for, let's say, number 2, or yeah, one of those may not be on the right spot here. It would be inclusive in one of those things, but it's not specifically called out in here.
So I have a question for the committee. Is there a specific way that you feel like your ethics and your diagnosis and treatment can only be taken in specific ways? You can't just do it as independent study. Would you want those same requirements for the board approved supervisor CEUs, or does it matter? If you look at B, as in boy, up at the top, the ethics specifically says, and I've added diagnosis and treatment into your reg that's going through right now. And it says the same thing. It can't come. You can only do it as a academic training, something with a post-test preparation and presentation, or an article. So you can't do cross-disciplinary or independent study, like just reading. It has to have a post-test. And I don't know that it matters. I'm just asking if you want me to add it. Do you have qualifiers of how it should be taken?
That's a really good question. I think on the one hand, when I think about as a person who's not connected to a university, how easy is it for me to find MFT focused approved supervision, like supervision training? I mean, it's not impossible, but I could see that being a challenge versus just like general being a supervisor training.
Right. I would say except for your profession, they have a really healthy training to be an approved supervisor, but others, it's more general to all the professions. So
Mhm.
I would agree with Jardine. It's something that, well, so I've been listening this whole time, and it's something that, yes, when I applied online, it did not ask me to have proof of my supervision, continuing ed, but it is also, when you're not in the university setting, not necessarily an easy thing to come by that is MFT specific. Even I've, attended the AMFT specific conference recently, and just I don't remember there being any options for supervision, and if there was likely just one. So I do think it is difficult to come by.
okay. So would you like me to go ahead then and talk to them and see if we can add that in? I think it's a good
I'm
idea.
still trying to figure out, I guess where I'm looking at it from, if you're working on the online application piece, we have it in a different place because we have it, the statute and the regulation about board approved supervisor. What continuing ed would not meet that in this document? So you're still doing continuing ed. We have another specific continuing ed as approved supervisors, but it's no different than the call out of the ethics and the diagnosis. These are all ways in which we can meet that. And so I guess as I'm thinking about it now, I'm not sure it's necessary to add it to this document because the methods of verifying it is what this is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I mean, we can do that if we want to. I'm just wanting to make sure we're not being overly.
I think what I was thinking here is if you're doing continue ed and you're an approved supervisor, you need your 6 hours of ethics or your 3 hours of ethics, your 6 hours of DSM, and you need a continuing ed for your approved supervisor piece, unless I'm not understanding that correct. So it seems like it seems like this would be a place where that might want to be delineated as well. But I'm not trying to make it harder. I mean,
It's almost like you need like a B
yeah, like
one that says
if you're an approved supervisor, I think it's 2 credits or whatever of spell that out. Now, if that's redundant to another location, then a reminder, referencing a person back to that other regulation.
Yeah, it's in statute, and I will say, generally speaking, licensees look at regulations much more often than they look at statute. And so it does make it difficult, and it sort of just depends on how picky they're being
Right.
when we write the regulation. But if you want it added, I can try doing that. I just let me know.
Again, I'm not trying to die on this hill. I'm just trying to make a point.
No, I agree with Christopher in the sense, if they land on just one page and they think, oh, I found it, they don't continue to keep looking. Like I wouldn't continue to keep looking. And so having it in both places, I think would be helpful.
Okay, so it sounds like similar to what's in B here, where it says those at least 3 hours. We could have a similar thing maybe at either at the end of that section that says if you're in a board approved supervisor and reiterate. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
So just for our minutes taker, what I'm picking up here, it sounds like a recommendation to add language, let's say to 102-5-10B at the end that just specifies for board approved supervisors what additional types of hours they need to have completed within each license period.
Yeah, it would be a new subsection, Dave.
Well, it looks like, I mean, it could be a new subsection, but B talks about during each 2 years what's required from the different groups. And so,
Well, but that's just for ethics. B is just for ethics.
okay.
The new one that's currently with the AG's office has a C talking about diagnosis and treatment. So
Okay.
then it would be a D for board approved supervisors.
Okay. And that sounds good.
Okay, thank you. Great discussion. Okay, the next item is the continued discussion on proposed changes of unprofessional conduct regulations. We have, again, looked at this document multiple times. And so we are at the point where we're wanting to get final recommendations to the board on unprofessional conduct. So Dave, I'll let you take the reins there again.
Okay. I've got a copy of that document. It's in your materials. It is a fairly lengthy document. It's 42 pages long, but it does include all of the proposed changes for the different regulations on unprofessional conduct across the 7 professions regulated by the BSRB. Since this has been put out, there have been a few updates by advisory committees as they have done this exercise that we're asking you to do, to look at what other advisory committees have recommended, to see if some of these would be appropriate for you to include in your unprofessional conduct regulations. But that's basically where we are today. We're hoping to finalize these so that they can be forwarded to the board. The board can review and discuss possible recommendations on changes to the unprofessional conduct regulations. But in your packet of material, you have markups that show how the regulation currently looks, and then how it would look with each of these currently proposed changes. And so if you have any further recommendations today, we could add this to the recommendations for your advisory committee. If you don't, that's okay too, but wanted to provide another opportunity for you in case you had any questions on maybe what other advisory committees had discussed for one of their recommendations, or if you did have any new additions. I'm sorry if this makes anyone dizzy. I'm going to try to go to your section. Okay, yeah, your section begins on page 19 of the combined document.
And I know I've been through this, so I know I didn't have any other changes, but we wanted to provide the opportunity for this committee to look at it again. You will note, if you remember some of the things we did change, we did take that 26 right there for sexual advances, intimacies, to fall in line with AAMFT. And then the record keeping and documentation boundaries. So I'll give you a chance to look at those.
I don't have any additional suggestions.
Same.
Anyone else? I want to give Heidi Marcy plenty of time to look at it. So I don't want to move you through it too quickly.
No, I don't see anything that changes. I think or not think, I know we discussed the social media piece with a client reaching out or following on X, I guess it's called now, or Instagram or something. And, you know, I don't know if we need to delineate the therapist responsibilities in those cases, or if this seems clear enough.
I guess I don't know what it looked like before, but it looks fine to me.
Yeah, and just to let you know, so the advisory committee reviewed this. The reason 56 is so lengthy, a lot of the different advisory committees or the different professions have a regulation that was for unprofessional conduct, and then a separate regulation that was unprofessional conduct regarding record keeping. And when we talked earlier about, most individuals are going to go to one spot to look for a certain thing, we thought it may not be helpful to have two separate ones. It may be better just to combine as many unprofessional conduct altogether. And so most of the advisory committees recommended just joining those two regulations as one versus having a separate one just for record keeping. So that's why 56 is kind of worded a little bit differently. But yeah, there was some different discussions by different advisory committees, and but that's one of the biggest reasons why that bulk of language is there for item 56.
Okay, it sounds like we are good to go on this. Thank you for that. Well, again, last time we'll bring this business up, but just to affirm our decision, we talked a lot about the profession serving as board approved supervisors for marriage and family therapists. The professional counselor group looked at this again too. Again, we're the only two that have this because we're the only two disciplines with the board approved supervisor. And they opted essentially, as I understand, Dave, to leave the language the same. And in doing so, then would leave an opportunity for the extenuating circumstances if there were a situation that presents where it might be some set of circumstances where supervision would only be able to be obtained by someone who's not an LCMFT, there would still be an opportunity to allow that, but it would be under those extenuating circumstance definitions. So Dave, Leslie, anyone want to expand on what I'm saying there?
Sure. Yeah, and I think one way to make sure that we're framing this conversation well is I'll bring up a copy of KAR 102-5-7A, which is the regulation that talks to who can serve as a supervisor. And we've talked about this previously, but looking at item C here, the clinical supervisor of a person attaining the 3,000 hours of postgraduate supervised professional experience required for licensure as a clinical marriage and family therapist. At the time of providing supervision, shall be a board-approved clinical supervisor. That's the first requirement. And then 2, shall meet one of the following provisions. And then in item number 1, it talks to the person being a marriage and family therapist. And so that is the first preference. However, there is language under item number 2 that says under extenuating circumstances approved by the board, the clinical supervisor may be a person who is registered, certified, or licensed at the graduate level to practice in one of the behavioral sciences and whose authorized scope of practice permits the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. The qualifying individual shall not have less than 2 years of professional experience and the independent practice of clinical marriage and family therapy beyond the date of the supervisor's registration, certification, or licensure. And the 2 items that we kind of referenced earlier that were up for discussion was this extenuating circumstances term is a term that is defined in regulation. It is a high bar test. It basically calls for an extreme condition that would be outside the person's control that would make them unable to meet the requirements. or make it inadvisable for them to meet the requirements. And the professional counselors regulation is very similar, but it also calls for extenuating circumstances. And so your position does not have to be the same as theirs. But just to kind of let you know the discussion that they had, and they've had quite a bit of discussion, and not everyone felt the same way. But the majority of members of the committee felt like there was a preference to really have a professional counselor being someone who would be providing this level of supervision. The question was, would they like to still allow someone the ability from another profession to be considered as a supervisor? And if so, is extenuating circumstance test the appropriate test? And for them, they determined that while they do have a strong preference for there to be a professional counselor providing the supervision, if it came down to no one would be able to provide the supervision from their profession, if it really was an extreme case, they wanted to allow a small path to be able to consider individuals from other professions. And so ultimately they decided that they wanted to continue to allow it as an option, but to keep the extenuating circumstances. And so they basically said our preference is still strongly to have a professional counselor provide this, but the bar is high enough with extenuating circumstances that we feel we can leave the existing language. So they took a vote and voted to keep the existing language based on the high bar of extenuating circumstances. For your profession, you don't have to do the same thing. You could reach whatever consideration you want to make, and then that would be forwarded to the board for review and their discussion. But you have similarly worded regulations. You do have language that really does point towards it being a marriage and family therapist providing supervision, but you do have existing language that allows people from other professions to become a board-approved supervisor. And as long as the extenuating circumstances bar can be met, those individuals could be approved currently to be supervisors in those extreme conditions. So hopefully that frames the conversation for today's discussion.
My experience of the professional counseling extenuating circumstance is that if there's a professional counselor within 60 miles of the person, then they are not approving outside, like other supervisors, other licensed supervisors. And I think that was an example for me of like, wow, that's a really high bar. And I don't even live in a rural place. I live in Manhattan. And we just happen to not have access to an LCPC. And so because our company provides supervision for staff, we have to contract with someone outside the company to provide the supervision for this employee so they could receive that benefit. So, I mean, yeah, it's a super high bar. I wonder, I know that Nicole feels really strongly about allowing for outside supervisors. And I guess, is there a similar litmus test that is like applied if someone in Western Kansas doesn't have access to a supervisor within an hour? Which even feels like too much because that's 3 hours of time that person's not working to get supervision if they're driving back and forth.
And Jardine, I really appreciate you bringing up the history of that topic because this has been something that has changed a little bit over the last few years. You are correct. In the past, one of the tests that was used had to do with availability. And availability was, one of the ways the board looked at it at that point was who was within a certain distance and could provide supervision. But over the last few years, there's been a change and the board has really made recommendations to open things up and allow all supervision to be provided either in person or by televideo. And with that change, it really changed it from a test of availability to a test of extenuating circumstances. And so in the past, you're right, we would look to see basically within a certain mile distance if someone was physically available or not. But with the change to allowing that supervision by televideo, now availability means something different. And so now it's really based on a different test, but that was the previous test.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay.
this is kind of a higher, I think a little bit higher than unavailable,
Mm-hmm.
since there's all online supervision.
Yeah. Yeah. As a person, like I'm curious about what is an extenuating circumstance that has been approved.
One is the VA. Someone was working at the VA and federal law prohibits their employees from seeking outside supervision. And they don't have, and I don't remember if it was LCPC or LCMFT,
Mm-hmm.
but they didn't have one on staff. So that was considered an extenuating circumstance and was approved.
Okay, that makes sense. I am still in favor of preferring LCMFTs for supervision. I just wanted to workshop that a little bit, I guess. So I appreciate that space to do that.
Is it approved per the supervisee or per the supervisor? Like, is it I'm finding a supervisor that's a social worker or a counselor or whatever, or is it I am a counselor and I have additional training in family therapy or couples therapy, and therefore I want to provide supervision?
The extenuating circumstance is approved by the board. So an LCMFT has, or an LMFT has to try and find an LCMFT supervisor. If they cannot, if they've contacted people and they just can't find anyone, then they could submit a request with someone from a different profession, but they would also have to be board approved. So a board approved LCPC supervisor or an LSCSW or LP who actually took a training and became board approved to provide supervision, then they could request that person be allowed to provide them supervision, and the board and or staff, depending on the situation, would have to make that determination to approve it or
And
not.
at that point, is there any, like, okay, let's go with that VA example. Is there anything we can do or not we, but the board to do to say, okay, yes, you can be supervised by this social worker, but we would like the social worker to take, I don't know, 5 hours, 6 hours of continuing ed in marriage and family therapy training?
Not currently. That would have to be something in statute that was changed to allow us to require that.
And maybe that's too complex, but I wonder if that's an alternative option too, because there is such a difference between systemic thinking and individual thinking. And I imagine for a newly licensed clinician to be from grad school, that whole systemic thinking thrown into supervision with someone who doesn't think like that at all would be, I think, pretty difficult for a supervisee.
So with respect to this particular regulation, I'm hearing that we're wanting to uphold this language. Okay, very good. And so we'll move forward with that as our final recommendation. And I do think there's good discussion there, Heidi, about, and that's, some of our previous discussion, even before you came on, is that I think this group feels very strongly that very same thing about having a systemic viewpoint in your supervision. And, this still allows for those exceptions in cases that, rather than someone not getting supervision at all. So, okay, thank you for that. I'll move on to the new business item of possible updates on education equivalency standards. Dave, I'll have you take that one.
Okay. So we've been starting to talk about work for the advisory committee for next year. And one of the regulations that some other advisory committees are looking at to make sure that we have good regulations with updated requirements and current standards is to look at the educational requirements and I guess probably to frame this, our licensing system in Kansas for most of the professions is built a certain way. The language in the regulations requires that individuals to have received appropriate education from a school that is accredited by a national accrediting body recognized by the board. And for most of the professions, there is a national accrediting body the board has selected and identified in regulation. And so if an individual has obtained their education from that school, coursework is sufficient, we're able to move those individuals through the licensure track very quickly. However, there are individuals who receive their education from schools that are not accredited by a national accrediting body. And in those instances, what we do is we review the information, or we have an expert review the information for the program and the coursework to determine if they have educational equivalency to what we would require from individuals who had obtained their education from an accredited program. And so basically the regulations are drafted that way. You either obtain your education from this school that's accredited by the national accrediting body, or you meet separately the requirements that are in the regulation. And for some of the other professions, those alternate requirements and regulations include both program requirements and also coursework requirements. And so in KAR 102-5-3, which I'll go ahead and share here, this does define the educational requirements for the marriage and family therapy licensure. And so this is an item that your advisory committee had previously had discussions about concerning the in-residence topic and the number of courses required while someone is physically present at the school. So those changes have already been recommended. Those are going through the process, so I don't want to confuse the issue on those. But if you look at section D, it says each marriage and family therapy program that is not accredited by the Commission on Accreditation for Marriage and Family Therapy shall meet all of the following conditions. And if you look at some of the language there, most of the language that begins with D and goes on further through the rest of this regulation deals primarily with coursework. Some of the other professions have a more detailed list of requirements for what the program would need to have. And so I guess just the question would be, or some maybe a homework topic for the next year would be to review this regulation and to look through the different sections beginning with D through the end of this regulation to see if you believe the language in this regulation is still current. And if someone is not from a national accredited program, are these still the items that should be required for that person to meet substantial equivalency or educational equivalency? And I realize that your backgrounds and your experience is not all the same, but I think it would be a good exercise for each of the advisory committees to go through their regulation on educational requirements and have some discussion about the different items in here. Because ultimately what comes down to the board's task in this is that if someone did attend a non-accredited school and their school did not fulfill all these requirements, the board is put in a position to weigh having to deny this person for licensure because it didn't meet certain requirements in the regulation. And so if some of these items in the regulation are not the best requirements moving forward to be included, then perhaps there could be a recommendation to change or remove those requirements. Or if something is definitely missing that is customary for those national accredited programs, that is really helpful for the public protection mission of the board to be included, there could be recommendations to add a certain item. This does not mean that there has to be established a gold standard in Kansas compared to what other states would require. But I think it would be helpful to make sure we're doing our due diligence by reviewing these regulations from time to time, and to make sure that we are asking individuals to meet as qualifications for licensure are the appropriate standards for those requirements. So wanted to basically just ask that between now and the next meeting, you start to review this regulation for further discussion. But hopefully that frames what we're asking the different advisory committees to do. And I wanted to open up to see if you have any questions on this app.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I appreciate you framing that because I think sometimes as advisory committee members, you may not understand the connection of how it comes into play for board members in determining if we can license somebody. So again, it's sort of like not the highest standard you're trying to meet, but what is that more minimum standard people need to have if they're not with an accredited program? Any questions or thoughts from the advisory committee?
I was just going to add that one thing that will need to be addressed either in this regulation or a different one, I'm not sure which, but I think this one is the ability to make up hours if their practicum didn't include 300 hours of direct client contact. So that's something we'll be looking at too.
Yeah, thank you. Good point. Okay, well, we will put that as our homework assignment for getting ready for the first of the year work as part of what we're doing in here. So thank you for that. That concludes our new business items and the old business items. So the next agenda item is looking at the February 9th as our next meeting date. Staying at this same interval.
Mary, what date did you say? I'm sorry.
It's February 9th, and it would be at 10 to noon.
Works for me.
Any other questions or comments for today's meeting?
Mary, I do have something. I had an approved supervisor reach out to me with questions about something, and I thought our discussion was something I wanted to bring to the board or to the committee, excuse me. So in this situation, this is a person who's an approved supervisor who's working with someone who is maybe like a third of the way through their supervisory hours, and they have just switched over to this new supervisor for whatever reason. So in just kind of getting to know each other and discussing what's been going on, the supervisee is in private practice, and they are that they were charging some pretty high rates in comparison to the person that supervised them before and then the new approved supervisor. And something that essentially came out of the conversation was that for the general public, if you see a person advertising themselves as a licensed whatever, that sounds like they're free and clear to do whatever because they have a license. But we know within the profession that a licensed marriage and family therapist is supposed to be under supervision. And we put that on the licensee to tell that to potential clients and to make sure that they're aware of what that means and that they have their supervisor's contact information and all of those things. But it's on those supervisees to do those things. Whereas when we look at other states around us, they have language like provisional marriage and family therapist or associate marriage and family therapist that really indicate, oh, like, so you're not licensed. So that when they're providing services, the public is aware. And I know that a change like that is a substantial change because it impacts all the other professions as well. But I think it's something that maybe the board as a whole should consider, just how does the names of our licenses, how does that impact the public's awareness of what they're getting into when they're working with someone who maybe is a new grad, but is a licensed marriage and family therapist. And so they don't necessarily know that that means that they have less than 2 years experience or that they should have a supervisor. And so there's not really a way for us to manage that unless something bad happens and then it gets reported to the board on the back end. So yeah, I just wanted to just share that concerned because I hadn't thought about it that way before. But just came out of the conversation with an approved supervisor. So I don't know that the committee necessarily can do anything about that, but I think that the board should maybe just consider that.
Yeah, interesting. A couple of things just, to pick out of what you said. Yeah, our state is unique. And I was reminded of that when we were at that recent conference, because so many of the states do have provisional or associate or use some other language around that. So that's interesting. And, I think for those who aren't on clinical training plans, the language of just being under the direction of someone is more loose. But I also feel like from the licensee standpoint, there is pretty significant language about their need to disclose. And you're right, it is their responsibility, but I think there's some weight put in the words around those things. So yeah, some interesting discussion for sure. I think as a personal opinion of just hearing all the things around us right now, I think because of the change in workforce initiatives and trying to make things more inclusive and easy, that might be read as a backstep somehow. I don't know how those conversations would go, but certainly I think anytime we want to bring something up for conversation, that's what we can do and should do.
Yeah, and Jordy and I had thoughts too when you were making those comments, because it is interesting. At the Marriage and Family Therapy Conference, we were talking about Kansas having 2 levels of permanent licensure, and I think we're somewhat unique. If I remember right, I believe they said Kansas and Ohio are the 2 states that have that. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of the other states use terms like provisional is because there's a real big push to make sure that everyone, or maybe there's only 1 level of permanent licensure at the independent level. And so individuals can get an authorization to practice below that, but it only lasts for a certain length of time. And if you don't move to a clinical level within a certain number of years, you just can't practice anymore. Whereas the system in Kansas is currently built that individuals can stay at those different levels, and they're considered permanent levels of licensure. It's one of the tricky things when we're talking about like the profession of social work. We have permanent licensure technically at the associate level, bachelor's, master's, and clinical, whereas some other states only have higher level licenses that are permanent. But we have people who've been associate social workers for over 40 years. And it is tricky though, because the term that we use for the title, marriage and family therapist, it means something different in Kansas than that title would mean in another state. And the same thing with professional counseling. A licensed professional counselor in another state might be an independent level, whereas in Kansas, we would call that a licensed clinical professional counselor. So I think one thing maybe the board could have a conversation about is maybe figuring out some good language that we could add at least to the BSRB website that might clarify the different levels of licensure in Kansas a little bit more. We do have an FAQ section for each one, but we can always add more information there. And I think I was recently talking to one of our newer board members, and he was asking some questions about the differences between the professions. And so I think that may be a helpful topic just to help the public understand a little bit more about what professions do, and some of the differences between the two, and then maybe a little bit about the differences between the levels of licensure too. So happy to continue that conversation with the board.
Thank you.
And I did have one more comment. It's in a different direction. And I'm sorry if I'm stealing Mary's thunder, but whenever we approach the holidays, I do want to say a special thank you to the different members of the advisory committee. I really do value your time and that you volunteer your hours every other month. These conversations are really, really helpful for the work of the board and the work of the agency in terms of getting some feedback and comments and ideas from all of you. It's very helpful for us to be able to put together good recommendations for the board to consider. And I know that you have a lot of other demands on your time, but really want to say, again, thank you for all that you do and all that you bring to these meetings, and really appreciate your service and looking forward to continuing to work with all of you in the next year.
Thank you so much for that, Dave. I appreciate your words, and I echo all of those things, and but also echo back to you and the BSRB staff for the great work that you're doing. You guys have done a tremendous amount of work in the last several years to make things more efficient and better for us all. But I think sometimes people don't know how much work you all do with a very small and mighty team. So thank you as well for what you do.
Well, thank you, Mary.
Well, if there's no other business, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Hi.
Bye.
Thank you all so much. Have a very happy holidays. We'll see you next year.
Thank you.
Happy holidays. Thank
Happy
you.
holidays,
Bye.
everyone.